Hello, dear viewer. Welcome to the channel. Please consider subscribing, as aside from releasing new music periodically as part of the band TCRXP, I'll also be using our channel to go over some of our favorite movies and do reviews and retrospectives, and occasionally go over some of our favorite albums and video games as well. So hit the bell for notifications. So right off the bat, I'm just going to say that when I review a movie and I go over it, that unless the video is marked spoiler free, that you should just always know that I'm going to be going over plot points that is potentially going to ruin things for you. I'll also say that today I'm going to be straight up breaking the first two rules and talking about Fight Club. So if you haven't watched this movie, man, it's been out for like over 20 years. So if you have not seen it and you don't want to be spoiled, stop now. But most people have seen this movie. It's been out so long. So let's get into it. That's right. Like I said, we're going to be talking about Fight Club, why this movie was such a great movie, at least for me, because I cannot speak for any of you watching this. When I think about this movie and what led to me eventually getting around to watching it, I can remember two things specifically, and one of them was that I was a freshman in college. One of my friends that I had just met as a freshman had a Fight Club button on his backpack, and I remember just looking at it and going like, man, that's really cool. Like, what is that? Like, because I had never heard of this film yet, or the novel at that point either, and I just thought it looked so cool. So two, when I did get to eventually watch Fight Club, it was actually with a different friend of mine, and he had the movie, just bought it on DVD, and so this is the end of the 90s going into 2000. You have to remember that VHS was still basically kind of king, and so I rarely got to watch movies on a disc yet. So collecting DVDs was something that I would get into within another year or so, but I wouldn't have access to any of that until I bought a PlayStation 2. And the fun fact here is the first movie I do remember buying was Ghostbusters, so it's probably pretty obvious we'll be going over that movie at some point. So I had no idea what Fight Club was when I sat down to watch it, but I was overly satisfied with the viewing experience.
No, wait, back up. Let me start earlier.
Fight Club was released on October 15th, 1999, and had a budget of about $63 million. And it turned in a draw of, about $101 million. It's not a terrible return, at least by my opinion. Since we're going over this film, we might as well briefly talk about what the hell it's even about, right? So, like I said, it's been out for 20 plus years. If you've never seen it, we're going into this. So, let's talk about what the movie's actually about, right? So, Fight Club stars Edward Norton and Brad Pitt as the two male lead characters. They're two men who were definitely coming into their own at this point in their careers. I feel like the film also had an impressive selection of background actors playing secondary characters, like Helena Bonham Carter, Meatloaf, and even Jared Leto shows up at some point to get his face smashed into Meatloaf, I guess. So you've got this narrator. We'll call him Jack, right? He's played by Norton, and he suffers from insomnia. And we'll get more into that in a minute, but he works as a recall coordinator. So his job has him traveling across the country, meeting single-serving friends and eating single-serving meals. And on one of these flights, he sits next to a man named Tyler Durden, played by Pitt. So soon afterwards, we find that Jack is returning home, and only to discover that all of his IKEA possession covered condo has been blown sky high. So whom does Jack turn to? He turns to the guy he just met on a plane earlier that night. Why? Because he honestly has no friends yet. Sure, he'll make lots of male friends and only one female friend, but we'll get into that later. And by the way, he calls him from a payphone, and Tyler Durden ignores the call and calls the number back, citing that he used star 69. Man, that's a really old reference. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the outdated things that are in this film, too. So they get together at a local pub. They drink some beer. They discuss consumerism. Then eventually they go out on the way out. They have a fist fight outside the bar when they leave. So Jack asks to stay with Tyler, who lives in this dilapidated house in a piece of shit industrial part of town. They end up spending their evenings outside the bar fighting one another, which eventually attracts a following of other men who see this going on and they want to join in. And ultimately, it grows large enough that they need space for this, little activity that they're doing. So they work out a deal and use the basement of the bar that they've been going to and fighting outside of. So there you have it. That's how Fight Club gets born. So let's talk about Jack's insomnia. Early in the film, we find him going to support group meetings because it helps him sleep when he's able to find an emotional release. He goes to all kinds of different groups, like for different things, testicular cancer being one of the big ones. But while he's there, we're introduced to Marla Singer, who's played by Helena Bonham Carter. Marla Singer is referred to as a tourist by Jack, who is using the group meetings for a purpose other than their original intent. She's a bit of a rebel, and she lives her life very carefree and isn't trapped in the middle-class malaise of consumerism that Jack is so trapped in. And Jack feels threatened by her very presence. And once they realize that they're going to the same meetings, Jack quickly proposes that they switch up the days and they only go to different meetings on different nights to avoid seeing one another. Though secretly, one could kind of see that Jack has feelings for Marla, and that's part of why he doesn't want her around. So back to the story. We're going to find Marla is overdosing on pills, and she calls Jack to sort of gloat about it, asking for help. But Jack's tired of dealing with her and the drama that she brings to his life, so he sets the phone down and just kind of walks away from it, only for the phone to be picked up by Tyler Durden, who quickly goes over to help Marla and takes her back to his place, and ultimately, they end up having sex, lots of it. So from here, we're going to be shown an interesting dynamic that develops between Jack and Marla and Tyler and Marla. And it's really cool as soon as Marla leaves the scene, Tyler would enter the scene, and Tyler's always warning Jack not to talk about him to Marla. It was a very clever thing that I didn't pick up on my first viewing, because this movie basically requires, and it only seems to get better with multiple viewings. So we've got Jack, who's unfulfilled by a job and no longer in possession of a condo full of possessions. He eventually blackmails his boss and ends up getting full monetary support. So this is how Fight Club gets, as they called it, corporate sponsorship. And it's at this point that the movie, it's starting to move in like this different direction, right? You have to remember that at the beginning of the film, its opening shows Jack with a gun in his mouth. So eventually it'll come back to this moment. And before we get to that, Fight Club has morphed into Project Mayhem, which is an anti-corporate, anti-materialist group. It cites acts of vandalism and creative variations of mayhem for sure. Jack becomes increasingly disturbed by Project Mayhem, though, as Tyler didn't bother to really include him in its creation. So in an attempt to halt the project, he tries to follow Tyler's paper trail, kind of going around the country and finding that Project Mayhem has basically embedded itself like a tick in all of these places. It's actually when he's at one of these cities that a fellow Mayhem member calls Jack by the name Tyler Durden. So we come to realize that Jack actually suffers from a personality disorder, and it was during Jack's insomnia that Tyler was really born, so to speak. So we get to the finale. We're going to find that Project Mayhem ultimately aims to destroy several buildings that contain credit card records and reports. It's at this final showdown that we come back to the film's opening scene, where we find Jack with a gun in his mouth held by Tyler. Only Jack's going to realize that Tyler's not really the one holding the gun, and that Jack is actually holding it. He'll pull the trigger and shoot himself through the mouth, which effectively kills off the Tyler Durden personality. The film's final shot is going to show us Jack and Marla together as the bombs planted by Project Mayhem in the buildings around them start to collapse, explode, coming down, completing the goal of Project Mayhem, with Jack telling Marla, "You met me at a very strange time in my life." So that's Fight Club in a nutshell. Like I said, it's best experienced over multiple viewings because the story has a lot of metaphors and foreshadowing all over the place that you're only going to pick up when you see it again and again. And I'll be honest, even after all these years, I still find stuff that I miss in previous viewing. It's really cool. So it's worth noting that the film is based on a novel of the same name by Chuck Palahniuk. It does sport some differences between the two. I read the book in 2009, 2010, so my memory is a little spotty on it, but I can't really remember anything being so different that it ruined watching. On a larger level, I love that this film is not afraid to take on topics like consumerism, generation angst, advertising culture, paths of enlightenment. Granted, this is based on a novel that covers all of this as well, but it's just really awesome to see in a movie that has all of these things going on so openly and in such a large quantity. Having spent at least almost 10 years after college working at professional office-based shit jobs where I was left feeling unfulfilled, I definitely can relate more and more with some of the concepts here that the narrator goes through. Identifying that being stuck in a middle class malaise is just as important as identifying the desire for the empowerment and awareness to grow and develop ways to get out of it. But let's be clear, falling on methods of mayhem, violence, and terror are not the way to go about doing it. Ultimately, it's incredibly important to note that Tyler Durden's push for awareness and empowerment ends up instead pushing an agenda of violence and terror. And Durden is the biggest toxic male part of this film. And while Tyler Durden definitely gets some of the best one-liners and wears some of the coolest outfits, I mean, seriously, his coffee cup bathrobe with the thing's hysterical. But idolizing him pushes the wrong agenda. And I'm not really kind of going to go over male toxicity in this video. I think that would be a great topic for a future video where we look at not only Tyler Durden, but other male characters in other films and break it down. And that could be a fun topic. But today, like this video, like this is strictly just kind of like my quick review of Fight Club. And if you are looking for additional information, the internet is full of it. All you gotta do is pull up Google, go to town.
Let's wrap it up.
So if in 2021 you still have not watched Fight Club, I'd say find yourself some time and watch it. Parts of it are very dated. Like I said earlier, there's a phone booth scene that is pretty funny just because Tyler Durden uses star 69 to find out what the narrator's phone number was. I remember the first time I watched that scene, I thought it was very clever and very funny, but now it's just kind of like, eh. So aside from the male toxicity problems of this film, it had a lot of really great things. The music was fantastic. The imagery was fantastic. Lots of subliminal things. You have to pay attention to see them in multiple viewings. I always like that when a movie can make me want to watch it several times to try and catch all of the little things that I miss. Fight Club offers that. So check it out if you've never seen it. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day to watch this. I will be trying to post film review content throughout the year, so if there is a movie you would like me to talk about, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to us. Hit the bell for notifications. Also, if you're interested in checking out the music of TCRXP, you can find all of our releases here on YouTube or whatever your favorite streaming platform happens to be. We're also set up on Venmo, PayPal, and Patreon if you're interested in being a patron and subscribing and helping us. All right, I want to thank you, and I hope you have a fantastic day.